on the ground next to it, taken its hand, and then, for whatever reason, died herself. But the girl didn't describe anything found with them other than those two complete skeletons, and she was only able to recover the two skulls. All of the other bones were apparently washed away in a flash flood, which is very unfortunate, but we're just so glad to have even the skull. Just that much is telling us so much that we would have no way of knowing otherwise.
We got another question from the chat room. Spin Dave makes a statement. Of course, it could also be a deformity caused by ritual binding, congenital defect, mutation, or glandular abnormalities. Is that possible?
I'm really glad that you asked that question, and I think that shows that you're thinking about it. If you go to the Star Child Project website, which is again www.starchildproject.com, we actually have a page there where we list off the most commonly suggested deformities that we've looked at and addressed. And to make a long story short, no, it's not any kind of artificial head binding. That leaves marks on the skull. And we had two different experts on our panel back in 2003 who were very experienced with what that looked like and were able to say definitively, no, this is not artificial head binding. That leaves marks. This doesn't have any marks. It doesn't have any of the hallmarks of head binding. This skull looks the way it looks because its genes told it to grow that way. Now, in terms of glandular disorders and other deformities and things, while there is an incredible range of different things that can go wrong in a human body and still produce someone that's alive, the level of difference in this skull, the number of things that are wrong, the things that are in it that have never been seen before lead us to believe that it really isn't the result of some benign natural phenomenon like that. Those fibers that I told you about inside the bone of the skull, we haven't been able to test them and find out what they are because no one has ever seen them before. There is no test invented to get those fibers out of the bone yet. We have things here that aren't just a little bit odd, they're absolutely off the chart. And now as we're doing more advanced genetic testing, everyone thinks that any gene in your body, you've got about 3 billion base pairs, all of us, in our genome. And people think any one of those base pairs can go wrong and you just get a person that's a little bit different than they would be otherwise. Well, sometimes you're right. A lot of the times you're not. There are actually, in general, specific places that are known to mutate. And if other places mutate, you just don't survive, especially in, for example, your mitochondrial DNA. That's the part of your DNA that primarily tells you how to make different proteins. If your body doesn't know how to make certain proteins, you can't survive. You can't live on planet Earth. If you are born, you will only live for a very, very short time. And yet we have a skeleton here that, as I mentioned, we have some teeth from it. One of them has already gone to testing, but we have another erupted teeth that you can see very clearly is ground down from years of eating grit-laden food. So this is a being that wasn't just a newborn, it was a person who had been around long enough to really grind the heck out of their teeth. So the odds of it being some kind of deformity like that are just so incredibly remote. This isn't me talking. I don't have a PhD. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a medical doctor. But that's why we have our research team. We have had a number of people who have all of those credentials, who've looked at it, who've researched it, who've invested parts of their life into trying to find out what this is, who have nothing to gain by making a misdiagnosis. In fact, it would be very detrimental to anyone who's made a misdiagnosis in the Star Child skull, who have come up and just say point blank, no, it's not. It really isn't any kind of deformity that anyone's ever seen before. We can't figure out how anyone could survive if they came out like this. There's something about this that we can't account for. And really, it just has completely ruled out the possibility of it being any kind of deformity or defect.
How has the Star Child skull impacted your life?
Well, as I said, when I first heard about it, I was scheduled to go back to Australia to resume my degree there, and I just never went back. I came to America instead. I became a full-time researcher on the project. I actually initially took over as the webmaster and have worked my way up from there. It has been a huge thing. As much as The Star Child, Lloyd Pye's book, again, Everything You Know Is Wrong, was such an eye-opener for me. I think after I read it, I crawled into bed for a few days and didn't want to get up because it was just so disturbing to realize the number of things that I had always taken for granted that weren't actually true.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Amy, but that statement you made there is so important. I think there's a corner that we all go around when we finally realize that what we think reality is, in fact, is not the way things are. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Did you really like almost stay in bed for 3 days?
I really did. Lloyd Pye actually brought me soup because he felt so bad about it. But I had been a very religious person, and I'm still very spiritual, but I think there's a big difference between being religious and churchy and having spirituality. But to go through and read, in particular, the sections of the book where he discussed the Sumerian tablets. Now, Sumeria is the oldest known civilization. It's in the modern-day Iraq-Iran area, but back, I think, 3,000 years ago, it was ancient Sumer. And these incredible people, just from nowhere. 1 minute they're hunter-gatherers, they're nomads, they're traveling around the place. The next minute they're building sophisticated cities with indoor plumbing, with hot and cold running water, with government, with libraries, with higher education, with the first system of writing that was ever created. And that writing that they developed was called cuneiform. And there are just a very few people in the world left who can read it. But Zecharia Sitchin, who unfortunately passed away last year, he learned ancient Sumerian so that he could read and decipher the writings that they had left behind. And a lot of the writings are just day-to-day grocery list equivalent things. But a lot of them are also their texts, their histories. And there is debate about whether these are mythology or whether they're actual history. But in their writings, they say, this is our history. This is how we came here. They absolutely wrote it as though it was the history of what happened. And what their history says is that aliens came down from heaven and they called them gods. That's multiple gods, small g. They came down, they could fly, they could travel incredible distances very quickly. They did all of these amazing things. And then you start reading things like these gods, these Anunnaki, came to Earth and they took the beings from Earth and they created a new race of people, and they created the first man, who they called Adamu, and they put him in the Eden. So you have Adam in the Garden of Eden, and it's just example after example. The idea of the flood, of there being an ark where they took the Sumerian text gives more of an indication that they may have taken genetic material from different creatures instead of actually taking two of each creature to become the new breeding pair. But so many of the different biblical stories that are found not just in the Christian Bible, but in religious texts in pretty much every part of the world. You can go to the remotest parts of outback Australia and they'll have a flood myth, and they'll have other things that are expressed in different religious texts. And people tell these as though they are their history. And as we go through and we learn more about the way the world works, different stories that are told in these so-called mythologies are coming to be more and more plausible, like the culture that says they saw a giant fire snake in the sky and then horrible things started happening. Well, if that was a solar flare, then yes, it would cause all kinds of horrible events like tidal waves and things on planet Earth. And it was just so many examples, one after another, of things like that all of a sudden clicked into place, and I just felt so foolish for not having questioned any of it beforehand. And it's laid out so well in that book. Again, I'm sorry to keep mentioning, but if you haven't read Everything You Know Is Wrong by Lloyd Pye, it will just knock your head off. It is so worth the read, and it's just page after page of things that were so shocking to me and so enlightening. It really was a turning point for me.
Well, Amy, we only have 1 minute left. If you wanted to tell the listeners about the Star Child website or anything else that's going on that you think is important, it'd be a good time to do so. And I want to thank you for being such a good guest, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us again someday.
Well, I've really enjoyed it, Mark. Thank you so much. Again, everyone, please do go and visit www.starchildproject.com. Especially take a look at that page on deformities, and there's a link on the homepage to a Wikipedia story that I think you will all find extremely interesting. So, again, thank you so much for having me, Mark. It's been a great show.
All right. Thanks, Amy. Have a good evening.
Thank you.